I didn't initially want to write this book. It was like I felt like I craved privacy, and now I'm writing this book.
Everybody makes their own decisions and everybody makes their own choices, but they're not the only ones that suffer the consequences.
That people are gonna point fingers and be like, oh, you want privacy, but now you're writing a book. Like, there's always naysayers. There's always people who are gonna just be like,
if somebody's gonna tell your story, you want to at least have control over it and be the one to tell it and have.
Welcome down the rabbit hole, friend. I'm glad to have you with me here today as we pick up where we left off. We're starting in the middle of chapter 1 and going through chapter 2 for a quick down and dirty of Jill Duggar's new book, Counting the Cost. The second part of the first chapter is all about Jill Duggar's perspective on her family becoming more and more involved in the IBLP. So from the perspective of a child, she knew that they were learning the principles at home, but it appears like everything really hit her like a ton of bricks when they actually started attending conferences. And the second part of chapter 1 is all about Jill's exposure to her first conference. And my biggest takeaway from this very important section of the chapter is all about the concept of the IBLP's model family. This is a concept I've never heard of before regarding the IBLP, and I'm very interested in what Jill has to say. She's giving us some behind the scenes information about what's going on here. So Jill went on to attend this big IBLP conference with her entire family, and it was really exciting for all the kids. Back then they didn't have a lot of money. This was a big deal. They all brought coloring books, crayons, snacks, and got into the van or bus or whatever, drove down to the conference, and they sat in bleachers together in a big auditorium. And for the first time in her life, Jill Duggar looked around and saw so many families, so many people, so many children who were finally just like her. And she had no idea there were all these people out there like her that were living this kind of lifestyle. And it was a big epiphany in her life. Wow, there are other people out there living like us. Most of the families were very large. I mean, she was seeing families with 20 kids walking around. They're all dressed the same, much like the Duggars were dressed at the very beginning of this series on TLC. And this conference was called Advanced Training Institute Family Conference, organized by the IBLP. And she immediately noticed that her mom and dad seemed really excited to be there and that they were looking around, listening intently, trying to get advice and information from everything that was being talked about in the conference.
With tears streaming down my cheeks in that laundry room, I truly believe God birthed a deep desire in my heart to encourage mommies, especially mothers with young children.
And as the event got underway, Jill says, I was spellbound by the music. The quartet sang in perfect harmony, and the whole auditorium was then led by a series of upbeat hymns. The singing was powerful, but it was nothing compared to the moment that IBLP's founder and leader, Mr. Bill Gothard, took the stage. She goes on to describe Bill Gothard and the fact that everyone looked at him as just the epitome of what they wanted to be. He spoke passionately about the value of children and the extreme importance of large families. Now, Mr. Gothard, Jill lets us know, didn't have a family of his own, but he wasn't like the rest of us, she says. The usual rules just didn't apply to him. He quoted scripture up on the stage, and then all of a sudden, from the side of the stage, he introduces and in walks a large Duggar-sized, Duggar-dressed family. A perfectly dressed dad leading a perfectly dressed mom with 8 perfectly dressed children following on behind. They all smiled as they moved with grace and elegance across the stage, arranging themselves in a perfect semicircle in front of the microphone. Mr. Gothard interviewed the dad briefly about how his business was prospering and how his family was such a blessing. And then he stepped back and the family prepared to launch into song. So it turns out that this was a tradition at all of the conferences, and actually people, all these families would apply ahead of time and then be interviewed. And I guess one, maybe a couple would be chosen to represent Bill Gothard's teachings and the IBLP as the model family of the conference. And it almost always included some kind of like singing or musical instrument number. Jill says, ahead of the conference, families could audition for the privilege of being invited on the stage. Now, what's interesting to me is Jill's looking at all these people up on stage, and she lets us know her family was nowhere near, in her opinion, good enough to be a model family. These model families were clean, perfect, well-dressed, standing completely still, and she did not see the Duggars as measuring up at that point in time. Jill specifically states, when we played our instruments at home, the sound was sometimes painful to hear. We didn't keep a strict early to bed, early to rise schedule, and we were told that was essential to success. We could just about get everybody dressed the same, but it wouldn't ever be long before someone spilled, smudged, or dribbled mess on their clothes. We weren't model family material. Well, not yet, at least. Little did Jill know what was to become of them as time marched on. Jill returned home from that IBLP conference with a new perspective on life because she realized there were so many other people out there. Many people were like their family, and she was delighted to know all of this. At one point, Jill became excited when a model family actually visited their area of Tawnytown, Arkansas, and came to one of the churches to give tips about their children. And she watched as her parents gleaned on to that family and wanted to know everything about how to do what they were doing a lot better.
If you don't answer my cry, I feel like my children are going to go under. This ship is going to sink. And yet God heard my cry. And then these words came to me. He said, Michelle, let the joy of the Lord be your strength.
Homeschooling continued under the tutelage of the IBLP, and things started changing for her dad because he decided that he was going to get involved in politics. Here comes Jim Bob driving that van with his face on the side of it. She also brings up the origin of the code word Nike. I thought it was interesting in this area of the book how she talks about the fact that the code word Nike is used on the show and in the Duggar children's everyday life to kind of call out to everyone and let everybody know that someone is walking by who is dressed inappropriately, for example. And so everyone needs to, when they hear the code word Nike, they look down at their shoes. They look down and they don't watch what's going on to either side of them. And this is especially important, Jill tells us, for the boys, but in general, it's something that everyone needs to obey. And they yell out the word Nike and everyone knows what it means, but no one around them in the general public will be offended by it. And Jill tells a story of how before they ever had the word Nike agreed upon by the entire family, they went out as a family and one of the kids yelled, "Don't look, it's inappropriate," or something about a girl that was passing by, and Michelle became very upset. And Jill says that Michelle spoke to her children and said, like, that's inappropriate. We could have really hurt that girl's feelings. Even though we know better, she may not know better, and it's not for us to judge her. And then Michelle tells all the kids and talks to them about how, I used to mow the lawn in my bikini when I was 17 years old. So I too have been a sinner, and I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings out there who doesn't know better. Now that we know better, we do better. But I've been in her shoes before. And so they agreed to start using the word Nike in order to convey that sin was going on around them. Jill, And I think it was funny that Jill was like, I was shocked hearing Mom talk about how she wasn't always the person she was today. And I think we all have that feeling about our parents in some way, shape, or form. But for Jill, it was like drastic. There's a drastic change in what happened with Michelle Duggar. And the chapter ends with the Duggars deciding to leave the church that they had attended for quite a long time when their children were little, because someone had invited some people to come and put on a Christmas program, and the female members of the youth group started dancing on stage. Jim Bob Duggar was completely taken aback by this, and he actually apologized to his family. I'm so sorry that you saw that. I will never go back to that church again. So things were starting to change, and they were going to move forward with going further and further down a fundamentalist path and incorporating the teachings of Bill Gothard and the IBLP. All right, Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is entitled A Window of Opportunity That God Has Given Us, and Other Half-Truths. In this chapter, Jill's going to open up a can of worms for us, letting us know that her father instilled in Jill and all the members of the family certain beliefs and ideas. And one of those ideas was that they got involved in the show for TLC because out of nowhere, a window of opportunity opened for them. And it was an opportunity to do a ministry and tell everyone about God and bring their brand of Christianity to the masses. They dare not question it. They dare not ask too many questions of anyone around them, especially not Jim Bob, because this was their window of opportunity to change the world. And the way that Jim Bob coached all of the children and everyone in the family about it is it's come into our lives for a reason. It could leave at any time. The show could end at any time. But for now, once again, this is our window of opportunity to make a difference. The chapter begins with talking about how when Josh got sent away, as in many other crucial situations that the Duggars encounter within this book, nobody talks about anything. Jill never really gets to ask questions. The parents don't talk much about it. They do have meetings where Jim Bob and Michelle will give some kind of blanket statement about what's going on, and everybody accepts what they have to say unconditionally, and it's really not talked about further. She says that it's not as though talking about what happened with Josh was off limits. It was just that people didn't really want to talk about it. And there was also a lot of fear involved in what was appropriate to say and not to say. Josh had been sent off to go work with some friends, and Jim Bob had said, hopefully it won't be long until he returns. Jill was happy to put what she had found out about her brother behind her and move on with her life. Much like a window of opportunity, her father also used a phrase that goes like this. The children were constantly reminded to not stir up contention among the brethren. This was a phrase that was used constantly, and it's used throughout the book by Jill. Even at the end, when things get really difficult, she keeps saying, I felt bad stirring up the brethren. And this led to Jill feeling like it would be inappropriate for her to even talk to her siblings about her feelings, to talk about what was going on, to give them information about what Dad had said to her behind closed doors, maybe about Josh, that none of that was ever really talked about. So it's interesting to me. You have all of these siblings. You're living in a house with a lot of people, but does anyone really know you? They certainly don't know what you're thinking and feeling when you can't even talk to them about some of the most important things that are happening to you in your life. The fact that you were told that your brother was inappropriate with you while you were sleeping, or whatever else was going on in the Duggar home at that time. They only ever really spoke to their parents directly about it. And it seems like in those conversations, Jim Bob and Michelle were really just talking at them. They did ask, and this is interesting, they would ask, like, do you want to talk about anything? Do you have anything that you want to say? But from Jill's perspective, it seems like she was just too afraid or worried or filled with anxiety to ask questions that were stirring in her heart. The window of opportunity had arisen for Jim Bob that he wanted to run for political office. Jill believed that he would win because they had put so much effort into everything and prayed so hard, but he didn't win. And Jim Bob said, well, God came to me and told me to run. He never said that I was going to win. So he kind of turned it around, made everybody feel better about everything. But it was from that political campaign that the children and their parents were written about in the local news, and Figure 8 Films came a-knockin', looking for Jim Bob and Michelle and asking them to participate in a series of documentaries that they were hoping to get onto TLC. It was interesting because Jill says that right at this time, when they were doing like some interviews with the magazine and they were going to meet with these people to do this documentary, Josh had been sent out of the home. And Jill heard her father talking about, I don't know if this is the right timing for us because our eldest son is out of the home. He's having some issues. And that's where the window of opportunity comes up, because eventually, even though they were all talking about like, is this the right timing? Should we really do this? We've got all these issues going on with Josh. Eventually, Jim Bob decided like, we're going to miss our window of opportunity if we don't hop on board this money train right now. And at the time, Jill didn't know anything about the potential of money here, but Jim Bob was really framing it as we are going to be a part of a really important and wonderful ministry. Next, in the chapter, filming begins, and Jill was told over and over again, just act natural. She said the cameras would be in her face when she was like grating cheese over a lasagna. She often was left feeling embarrassed, and that's a pretty constant theme throughout this book, and especially in some of these early chapters where I guess she's kind of a teenager, 12, 13, 14. She says, they wanted to show the viewers that we all shared the 2 bathrooms in the house, but it left me feeling embarrassed, uncomfortable, and a little unsafe. Not that I could express any of that to my parents. This was a God-given window of opportunity after all. The best thing I could do was bury my feelings. And we see so much of that throughout the book, especially in this chapter. Now, it wasn't all bad because things were happening, like they got to go grocery shopping with the film crew, and the film crew made the commitment to pay for everything. So whereas before, Jill says they would just buy like cans of beans, rice, they did not have the money to buy a lot of nice, flashy, more expensive foods. Whenever the film crew would go with them, Mom and Dad would let them buy a bunch of frozen items, chips and cookies and all kinds of things that they didn't normally eat. So she would be really excited, as well as the other siblings were also excited whenever the film crew would come around for a grocery shopping trip. By the time the first documentary, 14 Children and Pregnant Again, was complete, Josh had returned to live with the family. And she confirms his head had been shaved in an attempt to punish him or instill some humility. Now for Jill, she wasn't too worried about this because she feels like she had kind of moved on. She was living in her own world. And as a kid, she trusted that things were all better and they were fixed. Little did she know. There was also a lot going on because Mom had been pregnant again and given birth to child number 15, Jackson. And Jill does let us know that pregnancies weren't easy for Michelle, so there was a lot of support that was needed throughout the pregnancy, and they were all very excited when the baby was finally born. The Duggar family continued to grow. Michelle gave birth to Joanna, and it was time for the family to move into a new house. They had already bought some land and started working on building it themselves, which is what we saw on the show. But Jill lets us know that, of course, when the show wanted to come and do another documentary, what they needed to have happen was that house to get built so they could make a whole show around all of that happening. So they decided to infuse a bunch of money and assistance and support towards the Duggar family so that they could finish the house more quickly and they could put it on the show. So This was kind of the start of Jill realizing that they were getting benefits, financial benefits. At the time, I don't know that she thought that they were getting paid in any way, shape, or form, but they were getting help and some benefits from being on the show. After this, Jim Bob started referring to their situation as they are a filming family. We're just a filming family. We're a working family. We're a filming family. And everybody kind of adopted that sort of language, and they used that whenever something had to be done that wasn't necessarily like the easiest or the best possible scenario for everyone involved, including the kids. You have to get up early. We are a filming family. And Jill makes us aware that she watched as Jim Bob, her father, stayed steadfast in pushing that his faith was to be at the core of the show and it should not be pushed out of the episodes. And TLC wrote in the contract that Jim Bob would be given a lot of leeway to ensure that his religious faith was portrayed as he desired on TV. After the initial documentaries were done and they started filming for these really long seasons, Jill says that she noticed a big change. They were there an awful lot of the time. They would only come for like a couple of months for the year and do all of the filming then, but they would film, she says, like 3 to 5 days a week, many hours a day. They would be required to do things over and over again in order to ensure that a shot was taken in the correct way. Homeschooling was often interrupted so that they could do the filming, and there were a lot of trips. And she does talk about how like they had to keep things new and interesting, so they were constantly setting up some kind of weird scenario or going on a trip somewhere. And even though she really liked the trips, it was a lot of work for all of them to go on these big, crazy trips. There was a big board with information about like when filming would begin, and they would always have meetings, prayer meetings now kind of, she says, it took the place of like doing prayer that they would go over like what their filming schedule was for the week. So they're really becoming truly a filming family. And she started, once again, seeing a lot of financial benefits. Things like Jim Bob Duggar was getting them, new cars. Older kids could now drive cars. He would give them debit cards to use to go out and get food for the family. Everyone had a debit card. Maybe they had like a small cell phone. So she was seeing these small benefits here and there. And this all built up until finally Jim Bob Duggar, he heard from Bill Gothard that they were really impressed with how he was showing the world all about the IBLP and Bill Gothard's teachings. And Bill Gothard decided that he was going to take a trip with a bunch of people, like a congregation from Romania, to visit the Duggars. This was a huge deal because a lot of people were coming to visit them in Tawnytown, Arkansas. And Jill talks all about Michelle getting ready for it, how they had to ask everyone at their church to help, and that for the kids, they needed to be on their best behavior. The time had come for them to show that they were the most model family that they could be. I think Jill's kind of letting us know they still weren't at the top of the pack, but Bill Gothard was really interested in them because they were making money and they were getting famous. So they were becoming a model family, even if they didn't reach all of the standards of a model family. One issue that happened when Bill Gothard was visiting and the Romanian congregation was there is Jill lets us know that the congregation kind of came down a line of kids to say hi to them, and they would like hug the congregation. The people from Romania would hug the kids and give them a kiss on the cheek. And Jill kind of talked about how this was awkward and uncomfortable for everyone because they had been taught extensively to not do things like that. And they did try to chalk it up to a cultural difference, but it did seem awkward between the family and the congregation. As Bill Gothard came down the line and shook Jill's hand, she has this like famous statement that she says she made that lives on with her forever. She said, "Mr. Gothard, my parents have always told me they would have stopped having children after they had the twins, number 2 and 3. I'm number 4. So thank you for teaching them that children really are a blessing from the Lord." And she says at the time she was like so proud of herself for saying that. And she thought, she had done a great job of presenting herself to Gothard and that he looked really pleased with her. And what comes next is that Jana Duggar takes a special role and a special seat at the IBLP headquarters with Bill Gothard. Jill specifically states that everyone knew that Jana had been chosen because she was the eldest Duggar daughter, but also because she had blonde hair and was considered Bill Gothard's type of girl. And that the other girls in the house started calling Jana Gothard's girl. Makes you wonder. There's so much to be said about that, and I'm not going to speculate further at this time. Jill also talks about some other people, other families from the IBLP would come and visit the house, and Jill would help take care of the kids. She would be allowed to set up activities. One time she set up a water balloon fight, and it became a huge issue. The other family got really angry at Jill and said, why would you do this? This is against God. She felt incredibly embarrassed, and this is where I first start to see a lot of anxiety that Jill is dealing with, fear and anxiety that's internal for her. Really, there are two stories going on here. The story of what's actually happening around Jill, the reality of what's happening, the way that her father is responding to her, some of the negative and positive things that he's doing, neutral things. But then there's this whole other story going on of how Jill interprets everything, how she can never stand up for herself or question anything. Oftentimes she's confused about what's even going on when the question that she wants to ask seems so simple to me. Why wouldn't you ask your dad, what kind of contract you've signed up for, and then he would give you the information? She can't ask those questions for the longest time. There's a lot of fear, and it results in her getting into situations towards the middle and end of the book that her father is seemingly pushing her into that are not the best case scenario for her personal situation. And it's quite unfair. One of the biggest takeaways from this book for me is that I didn't realize there was such a disparity in the way Jim Bob Duggar was treating each child and is treating each child. I thought he treated them all like crap. So to find out that each child was treated so differently is quite a fascinating takeaway from this book, and we will be hearing more about that as the book goes on. The next part of chapter 2 has to do with the Holt's daughter and her relationship with Josh, the falling out that occurred, and the breaking up of the church. Okay, so we're going to stop here, and we will take a look at chapter 2.5 in my next video. Thank you so much for joining me here tonight, friends. I hope you will join me next time as we head down our next rabbit hole.